Hi, welcome to BetterWorldians Radio. BetterWorldians Radio is a weekly broadcast whose mission is to uplift and inspire you to make the world a better place. I'm Ray Hansel, joined today by my co-host, Gregory Hansel. BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. We believe that complex problems of our divisive world cannot be solved through negativity, blame, or impulsiveness. Solutions actually present themselves when we adopt fresh ideas, optimistic attitudes, and innovative responses. The BetterWorldians approach is to educate, inspire, and motivate people with positive thinking, positive values, and positive action. Joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio is Joseph Davis, Global Chief Economist at Vanguard. Joe is the global head of Vanguard Investment Strategy Group, whose research and client-facing team develops asset allocation strategies and conducts research on the capital markets, the global economy, portfolio construction, and related investment topics. Davis also chairs the firm's Strategic Asset Allocation Committee for multi-asset class investment solutions. As Vanguard's chief economist, Davis is a member of the senior portfolio management team for Vanguard Fixed Income Group. He's a frequent keynote speaker, has published white papers in leading academic and practitioner journals, and helped develop Vanguard Capital Markets Model and the firm's annual economic and capital markets outlook. Joe has earned his BA, summa cum laude, from St. Joe's University and his MA and Ph.D. in economics at Duke University. Joseph joins us today for a conversation with Greg about how he believes capitalism can be a force for good in our world.
Hi, Joe. This is Greg. Thanks for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
So, Joe, we've talked about this offline. Part of our mission at BetterWorldians is relaying to folks that far from being a predatory or manipulative system, as some would have it, capitalism is actually a force for good in the world. We've spoken with researchers like Raj Sisodia, who shared that capitalism has pulled more people out of poverty than any other system before it. So, from your perspective, as chief economist at one of the world's largest investment management companies, how do you see capitalism as an essential force for improving the world both today and into the kind of brave new world we're entering?
Sure, Greg. I think in many ways, the world has never been in a better place, although sometimes it actually may not seem that way.
Right.
But, it's been almost 10 years since the really tough economic and financial times we had, which are now commonly called the GFC or the global financial crisis, right? Mm-hmm. A significant number of job losses around the world. Financial markets plummeted in 2008, 2009, and some companies certainly went out of business. So it was a very traumatic time, but I can tell you when you look at the world economy today, as well as I would have made the same case 10 years ago, it's an economy that, may not be growing as quickly as the past, but the world is wealthier, and the biggest reason for that is businesses, individuals or large corporations continue to invest in their own workforce. They continue to see opportunities for expansion and profit opportunities, and that's because of the capitalistic global economy that we have. I mean, there are clear exceptions to that, but I think it would be fair to say that if we did not have markets and businesses empowered and enabled to make the sort of decisions that they make, either to add new employees or to expand their operations, and if they didn't have market signals to base those decisions on, which in many ways is the heart of capitalism, then I think world citizens would be poorer and worse off for it.
Interesting. Well, let me ask you, what's one thing that you think people don't consider or don't realize about capitalism, that does make it such a powerful ally in bringing about a better world?
Well, I think it's the fact that it's not a zero-sum game. And so the concept of a zero-sum game means that, whatever the phenomenon you're talking about, and here, Greg, we're talking about capitalism, but that generally speaking, because of that framework, standards of living increase over time. And so some will call that wealth, some will call that income. Others will call that financial security. But regardless of the term that you hang on it, it would be that on average, whether it's world citizens or if it's citizens within a country, that they are better off from a welfare perspective, again, standard living wealth income, than they would be if it was in a zero-sum sort of argument, which means someone has to lose at the expense of others.
Right.
Now, this comes up with respect to capitalism. It came up and continues to come up with things such as free trade.
Yes.
That is not to say that there are not industries, individuals, companies that quote-unquote lose, whether by going out of business or declaring bankruptcy or unfortunately losing a job because of competitive forces in the world.
Yeah.
But that does not mean that in aggregate wealth and better outcomes continue to increase. And in fact, the evidence all points to the fact that the world, either under capitalism or free trade, is better off because we have a world now where the poverty rates are at record lows since mankind learned to calculate and collect statistics, and we've seen that in any sort of economic measure, you name it. Now there's whole other issues that get brought into that conversation in terms of how equally the wealth is distributed and so forth, but that does not in any way, in my mind, change the ultimate conclusion that whether it's capitalism or these other concepts that contribute to a capitalistic global economy, that the world is improving and making progress under that framework.
No, I think it's a great point. I mean, it really is a rising tide that lifts all boats. And while there are some losers here and there, just in terms of how things shake out, that's kind of a natural thing. But generally speaking, you mentioned the data. We've covered it on the show many times, that the world is in a much better place than it's ever been, and capitalism has been one of the primary drivers of lifting so many communities out of poverty.
Yeah, no, I think the one thing, and I've talked about this with my colleagues in the profession. I'd say the one thing where economists, in the economics profession writ large, has done a relatively poor job, is in quantifying as well as underscoring those, again, industries, individuals, businesses, sectors of the, segments of a country that are on the losing end of the overall competitive forces in the world. I think, sometimes, and to be fair, I've caught myself doing this as well, Greg, where you wave your hand and say, hey, listen, the free market will take care of that.
Right.
But there's also, strong evidence that, there are concentrated, localized, painful losses, whether it's because of free trade or competition with China if you're in the United States, or more importantly than trade with other countries, has been the continued advent of technology, which roughly explains 80 to 90% of the job losses in certain sectors, not a sort of competition with another country. But I think economists have generally, I think, underappreciated some of the sort of investment needs or policy areas to increase either the skills through education or re-education or job training that some local communities or individuals need in a rapidly growing or changing world economy.
No, that's great. After the break, we'll talk a little bit about technology and what some of the fears are, but also some of the opportunities as well. But you bring up a point I wanted to ask you. It's a nice segue, which is what, if anything, in terms of how we think about capitalism right now, do you think needs to change? And I don't want to get too heady for the folks at home, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about complexity economics and non-equilibrium models. And again, I don't want to get too wrapped up in terminology. But what do you think, if anything, needs to change in how we think about it and how we change our models?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest lesson, or I'd say, both a lesson as well as a reminder for those in the economics profession, whether they've studied economics in school or an active reader and follower of economics. I think, I will bring back the global financial crisis. I think one of I'm a strong believer that one of the significant lessons of the GFC was that economics as a profession, I think we were somewhat unbalanced in terms of our focus in economics training as well as economic analysis. And specifically, I think too much reliance on mathematical models, and a little too underappreciated the lessons of economic history. I mean, economies change through time, but human behavior is a more difficult animal to change. And it was, in one sense, I'm probably biased by my conclusion because I studied economic history in graduate school. I didn't think I would draw on it so much during the global financial crisis, but as Mark Twain said, obviously, history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. But I think that was a reminder that too much mathematical analysis and estimation, quantifying economic phenomena is very important. But I think there was also an underappreciation of the historical context. What can we learn from history when you control for other forces that may help the current debate in either labor market disruption, which we could talk about today, trade, or the deflation? All of these topics we've seen or concerns we've seen throughout history. Now, again, financial markets are different today. Global economies are different today from the past, but that's not mean that history does not provide lessons. And that's something that I think that more recently academic economists have. There's been almost a renaissance in sort of the perspective of historical events as it may or may not have implications for today.
And I think it's really fascinating. I've been reading a bit about it myself recently just because I've gotten interested in some of the complexity stuff going on. And I think what the takeaway can be from folks listening is that, there really is a renaissance and rethinking going on that honors some of the difficulties that people went through in the global financial crisis, and also that those models are, as they're changing, are becoming more realistic and more mapped to, who and what we are as human beings and how we act. And I think that's exciting, and I think that's hopeful.
Yeah. And again, it's important. In my profession, I can tell you, so-called on the job or in the day job, a heavy reliance on computer statistical analysis, because anyone can tell a quote unquote good story, and you may not agree with that story or not, but I think so. Always having an empirical foundation is important to see how strong has that pattern been historically? How robust is it across countries? But again, that said, I think there was, I don't mean to be too critical of my own profession, but I think for many economists in the U.S., for example, they treated all history as if it started in 1960, because that's when many convenient macro statistics were available. When you and I both know it wasn't just the Great Depression, but there was a whole history of events in the 19th century that can lend some insight to whether we think markets today, for example, a very common application is some think interest rates are too low. Well, actually, when you look, the longer back in history you look, the more you find that U.S. interest rates, although they are low, they're not nearly as low as one would think. Right. When you look in the historical patterns of global integration, of inflation or the lack thereof. And so that in itself I think is important, because then that gives you some insight, or it may inform one's expectations going forward, that the current environment may not be as quote unquote profound, or this time may not be as different as perhaps the past.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think people can see that there's been some lessons learned, and there's new thinking, and as I heard even recently, you mentioned computer statistical analysis, the math and the science that we have now and the processing power makes these new models even more possible and more interesting. But, as we head into the break, I did want to ask you one question. Part of our mandate at BetterWorldians is encouraging trends within capitalism in the marketplace that inculcate pro-social behaviors. So trends that only help provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but that support altruism, optimism, charity, that kind of thing. What do you think about movements like social capitalism, conscious capitalism, double bottom line companies? What do you think about that trend?
Well, that I'm not as close to, Greg, as other trends. I think, how we even, it gets to your first question, how capital is allocated, and, how we can make the world a better place. I think, we will only see more changes. I would pivot, intentionally on what I have been focused more and more with respect to the outlook for the global economy. And so I'm a firm believer that the defining trend of all of our lifetimes for the next 2 or 3 decades will be how the nature of work changes. And we're seeing it. So it's not I'm not directly addressing your question, but I think there's a very important question that gets to even your mission of BetterWorldians. I think the nature of work is going to continue to fundamentally change over the next 2 or 3 decades, and that has implications for how we think about education. It has things of how we think about how society is structured. I don't have all the answers to how it will play out, but I can tell you that the analysis we've done has both opened our eyes, and it's a message, both one of urgency as well as one of cautious optimism for the years ahead. It's not all bad news, to the rise of artificial intelligence and robotics, but there is a sense of urgency of what economies around the world and businesses and institutions will need to do, and I would say even parents, if I might be bold enough to say, in terms of how we think of the future of work for not only for ourselves, but that of our children and loved ones.
Well, we're going to talk more with Joseph Davis, Global Chief Economist at Vanguard, in a moment. But right now, I'd like to take a brief break and tell our listeners a little bit about our sponsor, a social enterprise called A Better World. A Better World is an uplifting virtual world game on Facebook that encourages social good, positive mindsets, and giving back to social causes to make a positive difference in the world. Players do things like sharing acts of kindness, expressing gratitude, sending get-well notes to real-world sick children, and so much more. To date, over 4 million players have participated in this game and have performed over 40 million good deeds in over 100 countries around the world. Each month, the Better World partners with a different charity and challenges game players to do a certain number of good deeds within the game. When they do, A Better World releases funds to that monthly charity. This fall, A Better World is working with St. John's Hospice to provide shelter and supplies for homeless men in Philadelphia. You can find out more at abetterworld.com. And now let's welcome back Joseph Davis and my co-host, Gregory Hansel.
Joe, you were making a really important point before the break. And actually, I think I want to compress some of my questions and just let you talk a bit more about how the nature of work is changing. And I think what backgrounds that question, if I'm correct, are fears and just honest to God, witnessing of the changes in our society, like globalization, like technology, and how they're going to fundamentally revise and impact and force us to rethink what we mean by working and what we mean by being a society. Could you say some more things about that?
Yeah, so I would say when you ask the leading economists, big thinkers in the world, if you ask just as much the largest CEOs of the world, business leaders, if you ask technology experts, if you got them all in a room, right, and you ask them, what's the outlook for, let's say, jobs, employment, for all the major economies of the world, given what we are seeing is the continued sort of advances in technology, artificial intelligence, machine learning, smarter and cheaper computers. Right. We hear about robotics and self-driving cars. So when you get them in the room, or if you ask a poll of them, well, what's the sort of future? Right now, that community is divided pretty much in half, right down the middle. Some would say they're actually fairly optimistic, and they will say, listen, Joe or Greg, listen, there's always been technological disruption, but in the end, we've always had more jobs in the future than we've had in the past. And, they'll cite the first two industrial revolutions, the steam engine, electricity, and the combustion engine. And so, yeah, there was disruption, but we had more jobs. And the classic example is, for example, the U.S. economy, where 80% of the U.S. economy 150, 200 years ago was employed in farming, on the farm. Right. Now less than 1%, even though output is higher, and we've had millions upon millions more jobs than just even several decades ago. So that's the one camp. They're the glass half full sort of camp. Right. And they've always been right historically. Now the other camp, though, is they're clearly much more pessimistic, and they'll say that's a nice that's what's been like in the past, but the nature of technology, with computers able to do more human tasks that are not simply just very repetitive, say, on the assembly line, but starting to encroach on areas that would involve the service sector, things such as, I don't know, driving cars or being able to do more complex movements, being able to process information at lightning speed, that they will say that the future will be different. Now, we have had these concerns in the past. Actually, one of the most famous economists in the world, John Maynard Keynes, worried about things such as technological unemployment in the 20s. Now, those fears were unfounded, but the pessimists would say he was just too early. A recent study out of Oxford University even calculated that based upon the sort of nature of jobs in the world, that they think in as short as 10 years from now, 50% of the jobs in the United States will be automated away. And if you thought that was a high number, the pessimists would argue that it could be as high as 75 to 80% in China and similar numbers in India. So, and so that's, when obviously you read that study, it opens your eyes, and so that's, I think, what side is right. You can then at least appreciate the sort of view I have increasingly that the nature of work, how that evolves for all countries and markets over the next 10 or 15 years is a seminal question in front of us, all due respect to other issues in the world.
Right.
Because if those numbers are even close to being right, I think we have other issues to be concerned about than whether or not the Fed is going to raise rates or if China's growing 5 or 6% today. I think they look actually fairly trivial to those big picture issues.
Yeah, it's always a hard line to ride. Historically, we've seen things that we think would be dramatic changes not be. But, of course, sometimes, something new under the sun does come around. And if we're not ready for it, it's a big surprise. I think it's not just the issue of the jobs, although, of course, that's on everyone's mind today. How am I going to make money? But obviously, if you saw numbers like that, then what about the wages that actually drive the economy itself? It's more than just individual people that are thinking about their jobs. It's also, hey, could this really put the brakes on growth? Yeah.
And the thing that's so I think there's going to be the emergent paradox if we're for the next several years will be actually we'll have increasing concerns of automation anxiety, that's a phrase I would use with certain clients, automation anxiety, and yet we will have labor shortages. We have an unemployment rate in the U.S. that's roughly 4% and will very likely head lower. We have unemployment rates that are even lower still in Germany or Japan. Labor shortages will be actually the irony, despite the concern of the headlines. But I think longer term, I'm generally in more of the optimistic camp.
Sure.
Although I do caveat my comments. And I'm not trying to, I'm an economist, so I guess I juggle both hands here. Our analysis, we found, we found two fundamental flaws of those studies that cite those sobering 50 to 70% job loss numbers. One is they equate all jobs with one task. In other words, if the primary task of a job is to say, for example, drive a car, and if the technology exists to be able to automate that task, then all those jobs will go away. That's actually a very simplistic and inappropriate assumption. And what it turns out, and what we actually looked at all the tasks used, for example, in the United States of all the industries across the past 20 years, and it was a lot of data. It turns out that most jobs, think of your own job, what are the sort of tasks involved? It could be accessing information. It could be creative thinking. It could be making an argument. It could be managing others in terms of you're a manager. It could be coordinating with your peers at the organization. There are sort of verbs I use. That's a task. And when you look at the number of tasks in the average job, they're well north of 12 to 15. So even if we automate certain tasks, which we will do and we have always done in society, that's why our standard of living today is higher than, say, my great-grandparents' standard of living, that we will have more likely than not more jobs 10 years from now in the world, not fewer.
Yeah.
Now, however, the challenge and the good news, we'll probably spend about 80% of our time right now in the world, 50% of the average American workforce, 50% of our time is spent on what I would call uniquely human tasks. That was a specific phrase that we introduced for some clients. Uniquely human means, regardless of how smart computers become, human beings have a comparative advantage doing those tasks. Now, they may involve creative intelligence. They may involve skills such as empathy. They may involve skills such as being able to harness technology to come to a conclusion. It involves things around managing and leading others. They're just a few examples. Yeah. There's dozens and dozens of what we call uniquely human tasks. So more of our time will be spent on uniquely human tasks, and that's where the vast majority of demand for new jobs are, by the way. Now, the caveat is, however, probably 20 to 30% of certain, and again, it's not jobs that are important, it's tasks, but 20 to 30% of the tasks will increasingly be automated over the next decade, and if anything, that pace is accelerating. Yeah. So that does mean there are some jobs that are, because they are confined pretty much to repetitive tasks, that they will be, those employment areas will be under fire, and they will very likely, start to decline. So I think, what's the conclusion for this for your audience? It's something my conclusion is it's generally a positive outlook, but I think where the future jobs will be, it's not so much focusing on an occupation. It is focusing on three critically important skills that I think will be needed in the future. One is continued primacy and focus on what I would call creative intelligence, and that's not just in engineering or it can span a number of fields. The second one is emotional intelligence. Yeah. IQ is always important, but I think equally important in the future will be emotional intelligence, because that relates to how you interact and work with others, regardless of the business setting. And then the third one will be technological acumen. So it's the ability to use computers and technology as an asset in one's job. And many of your listeners would use technology in their own field. So rather than fearing technology, I think it's not just embracing it. I told my team here at work that, myself included, that everyone should be in their free time probably taking one or two free online classes to learn about a new technology, to see how, because it's changing so quickly, it could help one really become more productive at work. So I think those are the three skills that are going to be critically important, which means that education is arguably more important as it ever has been. And so I think that also has implications for how we think about either those individuals that may not be able to afford education or may not have the same educational opportunities as others, regardless of where they are in the world. Because it's ever more important in the face of the continued disruption which we will see over the coming decade.
Well, that's a great analysis, Joe. Thank you, and some really great recommendations. And we're with you here at BetterWorldians. You don't want to be Pollyanna-ish, but if you're running around saying, with your hair on fire, screaming the sky is falling, you're not going to really address challenges coming our way, and you're not going to have the right attitude by which to take advantages of those challenges and turn them into opportunities. So not to be too glib about it, but I do think that, with the right kind of thinking, with the right kind of attitude, we can use these changes, as difficult as they may be, to really propel us to a better world. No pun intended. I want to honor your time. There's just one last question I want to ask you. We ask it of all our guests every week. In your case, how do you hope that capitalism is helping to make the world a better place?
Well, I think again, it's a system or a framework. It's a marketplace that at the end of the day is one of meritocracy. It's where new ideas can be funded, business opportunities can be explored, and with that creates, again, wealth / opportunity / employment / standards of living improvements for us as global citizens. That does not mean that you do not need, say, guardrails on certain things. There are certain outcomes that say, listen, the free market may unintentionally create that you just want to make sure don't grow out of hand. And I think we will continue to always have those conversations. But ultimately, at the end of the day, individuals, companies, consumers, and I'd say countries are empowered to explore the sort of gifts and talents that they have innately as human beings, and we all have a different distribution and endowment of gifts. To be able to do that and to have the market help to inform those decisions based upon the prices it assigns or even the profit opportunity it assigns to help motivate all of us has been a instrumental game changer for mankind since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. I think it will continue to be the case. So I think there's always times when it's tested. There's always things that we can improve, but it's clearly we live in a better world today than I think our predecessors would have generations ago.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today on BetterWorldians Radio. This was a great episode. I'm sure our listeners are going to want to listen to this again and again. It's really a lot of really interesting observations and summed up in a relatively short period of time. By the way, for our listeners and for all you out there, BetterWorldians Radio is brought to you by BetterWorldians Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit whose mission is to make the world a better place by encouraging the very best in everyone. We believe it's essential to plant flowers and not just pull weeds. So we focus on positive thinking, positive values, and positive actions. In short, our vision is to bring out the better worldian in everybody so that we can all make it a better world. So go to betterworldians.org to become part of this important mission. And until next time, be a better worldian.